Okay, welcome. Good to see everybody today. Give me a thumbs up if the audio is working. Double check that, because that's always something that can go wrong. Okay, cool. Okay, great. And, okay, cool. Well, let's get started. So we're going to be talking about what is a minimally viable product, about how to create one and look at some examples. And this is a pretty important thing. On some recent projects I've been on, the key thing that determined whether the project, some projects that were successful and some projects that failed or got canceled, this was a key part of whether they were able to be successful or not. Because if they, here, let me mute everybody here. Just make sure no one has any surprises. There we go. Okay, so and the reason it was it becomes so important is if you're not able to deliver something in a minimal way, it's very easy to get to the point that you never deliver anything, or you don't deliver anything before you either run out of money or the customer runs out of patience. So this is a very valuable thing to be able to get right when you're delivering software. So let's look at question for you. Choose a definition of minimally viable product. I will see, I think I've got that ready to go. Paste the link in there. So how would you define a minimally viable product? And these are all definitions that I found in various places for an MVP. So it's not like there's a right or wrong answer. Just what do you see? How would you define an MVP? Okay, so over here we got the smallest thing that a real user might be able to use, a minimal version to validate a hypothesis. Over here, minimal version to collect the maximum validated learning about customers. I've heard that definition used before. Or a product with just enough features to get the attention of a customer, like maybe get them to give you money or something like that. So these are all, none of these are wrong. I've seen all of these used in different contexts. So, but I think it's important when you're working with your team, make sure you know how you're defining minimally viable product. Any of these may be fine in your particular situation, but if you've got people using different definitions, you can end up in a really bad place because you've got people trying to do entirely different things. If one group is saying, we want the smallest thing that a real user might be able to use, and other people are saying, we just want to validate our hypothesis, if you're just validating a hypothesis, you might be doing something that's not even, the user can't even touch. Whereas the people that are trying to follow this definition are going to try to get something that's actually usable by a user, and you'll run into a lot of conflict on how you prioritize stories. So let's talk about, so the idea of just enough features to get customers. The advantages of that would be, or what you'd actually get for that is you could attract early adopters, right? The minimal version that somebody could use, the people that it really, really meets their need, you could attract. Now that might not be the more mainstream users. You could start earning revenue, right? You may be able to get these just enough features to get customers to be able to fund the other stuff that will let you bring more customers in. And this type of approach means you're probably going to be able to start acquiring metrics to help guide your efforts. You'll have an idea of how things can grow going forward and what would be valuable to customers. So with the definition of minimal version to collect the maximum validated learning about customers, this is the lean startup definition. It focuses on intentional learning. So like, what's the smallest step we can take that will give us the most amount of validated learning so we know we're headed in the right direction? And once again, this means a situation where you're really focused on relevant metrics. An example of this, there's a book by Tim Ferriss called The 4-Hour Work Week that was a bestseller, did very, very well. But when he was trying to, let me get this mouse out of the way for us here. When he was trying to come up with the title of his book, he was asking himself, what's the minimal thing I need to do to collect the maximum validated learning about customers? And so for the purpose of understanding what would be a good title for the book, he went out to Google Ads and bought a bunch of ads for the 4-hour work week, the 2-hour work week, the 6-hour work week, the 8-hour work week, the 30-minute work week, all these different titles that were around what he was wanting to use, and probably some other variation as well. And then he counted how many times people were willing to click on that. So he was paying to show it to people, and then how many people actually clicked through. And if they clicked through, they just got a page that said, hey, sign up here, we'll let you know when the book is published. So it didn't actually take them to much anything other than building his list, but he was able to determine, to validate with the customers, what are people going to see as a title that resonates with them. And so that was the minimal version. All he had was a sign-up page, like a page for people to land on, and some Google Ads. The smallest thing he could possibly do to collect the maximum validated learning about customers. And you may not be like approaching customers just in the consumer space like that. Yours may be internal or something like that. But I think the idea here is really good, of thinking about, how can I do something to not just know what people say they're going to do, but actually know what they're going to do. You'll see situations where people are trying to sell a product, and the first thing they're trying to do is get you to pay $1 for something. Because if you're not willing to pay $1 for it, you're not going to be willing to pay something else. And so if they can find out how you behave with just $1, it will give them an idea of where you might be, give them an idea of whether what they're trying to present is valid or not, or whether people are actually going to be interested in it. So next definition was minimal version to validate a hypothesis. So this is a definition I've heard used at different places, and it's not necessarily bad, but my questions with this is, does it matter if it isn't about the customer? Like, are we just trying to validate a hypothesis of we can deploy Spring to AWS, or hypothesis of we can use Angular as a front end, or our developers can actually deploy something in Angular through to the cloud, or sometimes even our developers can even get this working on their local environment. So viable, when we say MVP, a minimal viable product, to me the word viable seems to imply more than just learning, right? It seems to imply that we have something that's viable in some way, that it can provide some value that goes beyond just what we're trying to learn from it. And like I said, it's not that these definitions are bad, but what I'm wanting to walk you through is the implications of these different definitions. Because like I said, if you're using one definition and the rest of your team is using a different one, it's going to be hard to make sure that it's going to be hard to be laser focused on what you're trying to deliver. Okay, and so the definition of the smallest thing a real user could use, well, you can't use something that isn't deployed. So that idea, if we use this for our definition of minimally viable product, it means that we've got to get something that we can actually get out that users can touch. It also means that many things are done in the simplest way possible. It probably means that it provides values. That should have been value. So it provides some type of value to a customer, because a real user isn't going to use it if it doesn't do anything for them. And it could be the piece of a system being replaced. If you've got a big system that you're trying to do a rewrite of, the minimally viable product could be, for the first thing, just a small sliver of it that you're going to move off and do somewhere. Yes, like happy path only. That could be an idea. The customer can use this, but it doesn't handle all the different error conditions that they want it to eventually. The customer can use the software, but it only works on Tuesdays, or something like that. I mean, that sounds a little bit silly. But if it is something, the smallest thing that a real customer could use, the happy path needs to be something that will provide enough value that they would actually want to do it. If the happy path doesn't provide enough value without having the unhappy paths or the different ways of doing things, it might not actually be the smallest thing that a real user could actually or would be willing to use. Okay, so in your current project, which improvement would be most beneficial? So just a question, like I said, no right or wrong answer here, but would it be better clarity in prioritizing work? Would it be limiting scope creep, starting to earn a return on investment sooner, or earlier evidence that a team can deliver a working product? So in the project you're working on day to day, the project you're taking a break from to come to this lunch and learn, which improvement would be most beneficial? If somebody can throw the link to Mentimeter back in the chat there, that would be great, because some people, it looks like some people have joined and may not have that yet. Or here, I can jump over. Okay, yeah. Thank you so much, Tom. Okay, that's great. And if for some reason you can't see the chat, there should be a little chat icon that you can click on and it'll open up. Or if not, just go to menti.com and you can type in that 8-digit number. And do bring this up, because this is how we interact, and it's more fun this way. Okay, so most of us are saying their current project, if we could have better clarity in prioritizing our work, that would be the most beneficial improvement. Second is limiting scope creep. Third is starting to earn a return on investment. And fourth is earlier evidence from the team that the team can actually deliver a working product. And I'd like to suggest that all of these things, a good approach to a minimal viable product approach to the way that you're working on your software, will help with every single one of these if you're doing it correctly. Clarity and limiting scope, right? And it's not like I said, there's not a right answer here. So just choose whichever one comes to your mind as being the most valuable. Because my point is that all of these things, wherever you happen to fall, these are all things that you can improve by bringing a minimally viable product mindset to your project. Because if you've really got a clear idea of if you're really focused on delivering the minimally viable product, it's going to be a lot easier to have clarity in prioritizing things. Because you're going to have to ask yourself with every story you look at and say, is there any way we could actually go live, we could make an MVP without this? And if the answer is yes, then it goes lower down on the priority than something else that the answer is no. And I know it sounds really simple when you say that, but that's a really, really hard thing for teams to do. And teams that get good at it can be incredibly successful. Teams that aren't good at it can fail miserably. Limiting scope creep. If you've got the customers and the business and the developers and everybody really focused on how they're going to deliver the minimally viable version of this, it's a lot easier to limit the scope, because everybody's trying to do the same thing. It's a lot easier to start earning a return on investment sooner if everybody's really focused on what it takes to get an MVP through to production. And it's a lot easier to get earlier evidence that the team can deliver a working product, because they're very, very focused on how do we get something that's workable, that actually user can use and get it into people's hands. So let's talk about the prioritization here. Let me see what slides I've got up there. Okay, so the prioritization, like I was saying, if you can get a team very focused on the minimally viable product, the prioritization becomes a lot easier. I was in a prioritization meeting one time. We were working on we were going to replace the billing system for a bank. And we were talking through what needed to happen. We were trying to prioritize stuff. And we were really trying to push toward this idea of what's the smallest thing we can possibly do that will let us process our billing. There's 100 things that the product does that the thing we're replacing can do today that don't fall into that bucket of we need this in order to process our process billing for the bank. And it was very difficult conversation, because there were a lot of people that really felt they had something that they wanted. Like the reason they were supporting this rewrite is because they wanted A, B, and C, even though the current project didn't do it. So they wanted to make sure that A, B, and C was called part of the MVP, because it was really, really important to them, even though it wasn't something that the current project or current software did. And so that prioritization was really, really hard to do until we got everybody on the same page of understanding that getting a minimally viable version of this out that could run, and then bringing the next most important thing, if we were able to do that, our chances of success were much higher than if everybody shoved everything they could possibly want into the first version of this. And so we ended up with the individual that was kind of helping run things here did a great job. And he said, okay, we're going to have one bucket here that is MVP. Nothing goes in here unless we have to have it in order to process a bill. Then we've got another bucket here that is non-MVP. And people were really struggling because they really wanted their things to be classified as MVP. So he created another bucket and said, these are the fast follows. So once we're able to process a bill and this is running live, these are the next things we're going to work on. And that kind of broke the logjam, and people were able to prioritize things better by saying, okay, you're recognizing that what I want is really, really important because you're not putting it in the, the third bucket. But I understand that we will increase our chances of success if we get something deployed and running sooner and then start iterating on top of it. And that was a simple way to do it, but it took a lot of work to get people to that mentality of, I understand that getting an MVP out is so important. I'm willing to wait to not have my thing as part of, my pet project as part of that very first version. Limiting scope creep. So imagine you need a pocket knife to cut an apple or whatever you use pocket knives for. And so you ask somebody to build you a pocket knife, and they start building this monstrosity right here. Now, it's really, really cool, but if what you need is just the pocket knife and you have to wait until all these other things are built, you may starve to death, right? Before you get all the way down here to the fingernail clippers and the whatever that circular thing is. And it looks like there's even some type of needle there maybe it's for sometimes, I don't know what all these things are. But the point is, this is something, the scope has grown here. And that might be, this is a really cool tool. I don't know how practical it is, but it's pretty interesting. But at the same time, if you've got to wait to get any value from this because the scope, hey, we can just add one more thing, you may get to the point where the project gets canceled before you actually get to the point that you can use any of it. And this is another very important thing that having an MVP mentality and approach to things can really help with is, what's the minimal thing that I can actually start getting value from? I can start getting into customers' hands, start getting feedback from, of really using it. If we were to approach an MVP with this, the question would be, what's the first thing you could actually use as a customer? And if they say, my biggest problem is I've got hangnails and I need to clip my nails. Well, then maybe you build that fingernail clipper thing right up there. Or my biggest problem is I need to open a can of beans, or whatever. Well, then the can opener becomes the most important or whatever. But the point is, the value of some piece of this is much greater delivered and being able to be used than having to wait for the whole thing. And that mentality can really help limit scope creep, but it only works if you can get everybody bought into it. If you just have developers focused on doing an MVP mindset and the customer says, I don't want to talk to you until the whole thing's done, that's not going to be successful. Or if you just got the customers saying they want an MVP approach, like give us the smallest thing possible, let's start getting it to prove that the developers can actually deliver this. And the developers are saying, well, I know that's what they're asking for, but that's not really what they want. What they really want is all this stuff. So we're going to do all this development work before we actually deliver something. You're not going to be successful. And I've actually heard development teams say stuff like that, of saying, yes, the customer says they want the MVP, but they really don't know what they're talking about. What they really want here is all these other things. So we're not going to give them anything in this sprint that they can use. We're going to wait and spend months working on building out this stuff so it will be everything they want instead of just the thing they're saying right now. And that's a dangerous place to be in because you don't build that trust and you can end up getting a situation where your project gets canceled. Earlier evidence of success or failure. So if you're taking an MVP approach to delivering software, it means you're going to have to take steps to actually prove that what you're building is valuable. So if I'm taking an MVP approach, minimally viable product of how do I get this into customers' hands so they can start getting value from it? And if I try to cheat that and say, well, we're going to build this stuff, but we're not going to actually deploy it, we're not building an MVP anymore, right? We're doing something else. And so the MVP approach helps get evidence of success or failure early on. If you've got a development team and the customers, you sit down with the customer and you're like, okay, what's the smallest thing that could possibly provide value? Like take the billing thing, for example. And they say, okay, the smallest thing is being able to process just this one type of bill all the way through to where you get the input from it and it gives you this output over here. That would be the smallest thing that we want to do that we can start showing, even if it's not the system of record yet, it's the smallest thing that can start doing real work. Let's make that our MVP. Well, if you've got that and the customer's expecting that this whole project is going to take a year, and for some reason the developers have trouble delivering that in 9 months, or 6 months, or even 3 months, and there's a whole bunch of other work, you've now got some pretty good evidence that this isn't going to actually meet the needs of the business. On the other hand, if they're able to deliver that in a reasonable period of time, the business can look at that and say, hey, this looks good. We have succeeded at this piece of it. I now have some trust that the next piece of it, we can do the same thing again, and maybe even do better now that we've learned some things together. So taking the MVP approach, it can be a very important way of getting earlier evidence of success or failure so you can readjust. It's very easy to get into situations where you are so focused on building runway and all these things that you're not going to use until the future in a way that makes it hard to see that you actually don't have the capability to deliver efficiently. So, for example, if you've got a project and let's say the project's expected to take 3 years or something like that, and instead of the MVP approach, you start taking the approach of, well, you know what, we need to build all this runway out. So there's all this work we want to do before we start working on software, on stuff that the customer can see. So we're going to build all this foundation out first, and then we'll start on the software pieces of it. So let's say they expect it to take 3 years, and for some reason, this foundational work is mapped out to take a year. Well, that means you're not really going to have any evidence that anything can be produced till at the end of that year, and even beyond that, right? So with the MVP approach, you've got to actually figure out and say, how do I build just enough of the runway that I need, just enough of the foundation that we need in order to go ahead and deliver something through to the customer? And that dramatically lowers your risk because it increases your trust and helps get that feedback going. But it's really easy to look at it and assume that, well, this would be more efficient if we build all this stuff first because we're going to need it later. And that, while I recognize how enticing that sounds, because then we won't have to change anything, or we'll have everything in place we need to really go fast, I've never seen it actually work out that way. It incurs a huge amount of risk that I've never seen actually pay off for any team that has tried to do that approach. But just telling people, well, prioritize better or work on smaller units without having the MVP drive can be very difficult to do. So this is another area that MVPs can improve your delivery. And earlier return on investment. I'm working with some of the software projects I'm working on right now with a genetics lab here in town. What we're really trying, we built lots of stuff for them, but we're really trying to get back to how do we give you the smallest thing that helps you make more money? Because if we can do that, they can start earning a return on investment, which helps to make their business even more successful than it is, but also helps make it easier for them to justify the money they're pouring into development. If we build things that they ask for, but they're not going to be able to use for a few years, versus something that they need today that will make them more efficient, the return on investment for those things, it's a lot easier to get excited about the stuff that's helping people today instead of the things that may only be beneficial way down the road. So, matter of fact, a meeting I was at this morning, we were really asking them and say, okay, here's what you're doing in your lab. Walk me through what you're doing in your lab and go through that and say, what is the smallest thing we can deliver to you that you can start giving us feedback on whether or not it's benefiting you or not. So there's lots of data that has to be managed in different places in remote locations and coming in. There are a bunch of very smart people that have found great ways to make this work, but they're having to do a lot of double entry and things like that. So what we're doing is looking at that and saying, okay, what would happen if we tried this? Here's the minimally viable thing we think that would help you with this. And we talked through it and we came up with a few things that are fairly small as far as programming effort goes, but they should have a big impact in what they're doing, because we're trying to be focused by that earlier return on investment by finding the minimally viable thing that can let them get some improvement. Okay, so question for you now. So back to these 4 things we talked about before. So rank the following benefits, this time not only in how important it is to your success, but also how hard it is for your team. So you'll rank it by saying, how important is this, which we kind of did already, but then how hard is this for your team? because you may find that something is really, really important to the team, but very, very difficult, or really important to the team and maybe not quite as hard to do. And this will address the issue with, I think, Greg, you had said that it's toss-up between two things. This doesn't require you to just choose one. You can choose all of them. So go ahead and rank those. I'll paste this in here one more time. And this isn't a quiz. There is not a right or wrong answer. This is just how you feel about your project. Because I'm just kind of curious to see where things are saying, what we think is easy and what we think is hard. And it looks like, cool. Yeah, this is the reason I really like Mentimeter, is because you can do these graphs. The other tools I have don't let me do that. So I like to pull these out every once in a while. So it looks like we've got more spread in the up and down, right? So we're saying clarity and prioritizing work is the most important thing still to people, which it was earlier. Earning a return on investment sooner isn't. Now this is interesting, and it probably has to do with kind of the makeup of this particular crowd. If this was a group of people that are running startups, I'd assume that number 3 would probably be a lot higher in the importance scale. We're all kind of clustered in the same general area though. But and side to side, we're saying that earlier evidence that the team can deliver working product is actually easier than limiting scope creep. Which things there is, it sounds like the limiting scope creep is a very, very is a big issue for everyone, which is very true. It's very easy to try to fit just one more thing in, and I was thinking about this the other day, and I realized that a lot of times the way that we structure our work with each other and the rewards mechanisms, if you will, I think is probably the best way of describing it. We tend to reward doing a little bit extra more than delivering something sooner, or delivering smaller iterations. And so there's ways on your team to try to get the focus away from celebrating that, hey, look, we got all this, Cowboy Coder went got all this stuff done, even though it wasn't in the sprint or whatever, and celebrate more the consistent delivery of small things all the way through. I think that's the way to kind of push toward limiting scope creep, is making sure we're able to deliver just the minimal way to meet stuff and get it all the way through. And we'll look at some examples of this here in just a little bit. Okay, so I was going through some of my talks looking for pictures I could use in various projects and things, and I discovered I'm not very photogenic when doing these lunch and learns, and this was one of the screenshots that kind of stood out. Delay management with one more thing adds a huge amount of work. Yes, and it's not. I think the key is to deliver something and then deliver something else, and delight management with the number of unique things that you delivered all the way through to completion, instead of how you were able to take one story and fit more stuff in it. Anyway, this is non-photogenic me, but the point I wanted to talk about is I wanted to talk about lunch and learn invites and a minimally viable product for that. So you're coming to these lunch and learns, you probably get these invites in the show up in Outlook or whatever you're using that remind you, hey, I could spend my lunch listening to Mark talk about software development. But we did not start out quite with that. So here's a little bit of where we start out with. The very first minimally viable version of this was I had an Outlook. I was copying and pasting stuff into Outlook to send to people. And it was just copying and pasting it. After a while, we got to a point where I couldn't do that anymore. And we ended up with an Excel spreadsheet because I had to copy and paste it into 2 separate emails because the group was too big just to send out in one email anymore, because Outlook has a limit of, I think, 500 people or so. So we did that for a while, and then I kind of was moving off Outlook, and I ended up saying, well, we need a different way to do this. So I ended up with a Google Groups that I was sending the invites to. But I needed some way to get the people that showed up back into the Google Groups so they were signed up for it. So I eventually created just a simple Postgres database, and I would export the people that came, put it in Postgres. It would go ahead and take all the people and then give me a file that I'd export that I put in the Google Groups. And this was lots of manual work. But what I want you to notice here in looking at how we actually set this up, I didn't start with the idea of delivering a piece of software. I started with the actual function I was trying to do, which was I need to get invites to people. And for a while, Outlook copy and paste was just fine for that. And if no one had showed up, maybe that would have been it, right? I didn't build anything because I didn't need it. Then we got to the point that we were doing it in Excel. Then the point where we were doing it actually in a database. Then eventually I had an export working with Salesforce, and that was working. Then we eventually got to the point where the manual time it was taking me to do this took quite a bit. So I ended up with a web service that would take, when somebody comes to the WebEx, it would pull all those into Salesforce and then push it back out to the Google Groups. So I had a list, like if you ever got an email from me that said something about, hey, I saw you attended the Kanban talk, we've got this other thing going on here, and it was targeted just to people that came to that talk, that was actually coming from the ability to pull this stuff into Salesforce. But it grew. It grew based on just being able to take these steps on what's the next thing that would be beneficial for doing these lunch and learns. Then we eventually moved to ERP Next based site. So if you go to the site and events.xeric.net and it lists out all the sites, there's probably nothing there now because I need to schedule some more. That's actually in this ERP Next based site. And we started developing it there. And the most recent thing we've done is trying to make it to where if we send an invite out, and you reply and you say yes you're coming, or no you're not, or maybe, okay, you replied to that, you obviously saw it, we don't need to do anything else. But usually the day before, if someone didn't reply to it, it's nice to send them a reminder saying, hey, don't forget, you didn't say whether you were coming or not to this. Here's the invite again, in case it's something that's interesting to you, or pass it on to your team. So that ability to resend invites to people that haven't responded is the next kind of piece. And that resend invites, the way that we started with is, what's the minimally viable way that we could possibly do this? And it was like, okay, well, we've got these people that we've sent the invite to. We need to uncheck from them that they've gotten the invite so we can send it again. And we started out just by going through and clicking on every one to undo the checkbox. And it was a big pain and took a lot of time. But when we did that, we found, hey, this actually works well. People come that would have forgotten about it otherwise. So now we're taking the step of how can we automate this. But the whole thing step by step was, what's the smallest thing we can do that's viable for helping us take the next step forward? Not because we're going to stay in this, lots of manual work way, or a way that's kind of clunky for us to do, but it's a way for us to actually get feedback on, is this working? Does this help? Do people like it? What if we resent the invite and everybody's like, never do that again? Okay, well then we wouldn't do that anymore. But a lot of people were saying it looked like it was helpful. But the point I want to make is, most of this stuff wasn't driven by what's the software we want to create. It was driven by what's the next business functionality that we want to try out. And if we can try it out in the smallest way possible, we can then use that feedback and decide, okay, this is possible, but man, I'm staying up 5 hours, click, 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 click. I don't want to do that anymore. Now let's go ahead and invest in automating it. But we had some way of just taking that small step. And this is a really valuable approach to creating software, because it makes sure you're not spending lots of time building stuff that it turns out you don't need, or that you're not going to get a return on investment from. Another example here of an MVP approach. This was a system for a government project, and one of the things it needed to do is it needed to know when the federal holidays were, because things couldn't happen on federal holidays. And the current system, what they wanted was the ability to go in and in the UI manage the holidays. But when we started talking to them about, is this actually MVP? Is there any way we could start using this without having that? They said, no, it's not actually MVP. And the customers decided that going live was more valuable than having a user interface to do this. And I'm not even sure if they ever built the user interface, because what they did is they decided, we can just do this in Excel and just upload it straight into the database. It's low risk. It's just the calendars. This is easy to do in Excel. We'll go ahead and do that, because we would rather go live sooner than delay the launch of this in order to build this UI. And that was a decision that they made. And they made that same type of decision on hundreds, if not thousands, of other things that they really, really wanted, but weren't actually MVP. Well, as a result of that, they were able to take this project that was quoted at being $50 million to go live, and they were able to go live with it for only $15 million. And they did it with 5 to 8 devs instead of the 50 devs that had been predicted. It was massively successful, and they were able to dramatically lower risk. Other similar sized projects I've seen where they did not take this approach, the scope just continued to grow and they never got to a point where they were able to take it live, and eventually the projects got canceled because this conversation was not happening. And that's how valuable this actually is, because it's really easy to cancel. It's really easy to get to a situation that the customers can lose, and whoever's funding it can lose faith that in the development team and being able to deliver, because they're not seeing something that's usable that they can actually say, hey, we can go live with this. And then they can shoot. Like this particular team, if they had gotten to the point that they were ready to go live with everything except for this calendar thing, they could have chosen and said, okay, we really want the calendar thing. Let's delay going live. But giving them that option was important. And without having that option, they couldn't choose both ways. If we had just built it at the very beginning, they wouldn't have had the option to go live without it. You can't ever take software that you created and exchange it for the calendar, for moving your go live date on the calendar just because you want a different date. The only way to do it is to push it out is to delay working on those things. And that's what MVP helps you do. So a question that will probably come up is, does the customer actually want an MVP? Do they actually want you to deliver something as a minimally viable product? And if you have the conversation and they understand what they're getting and the risks they're incurring if they don't, they probably it's likely that they do. Another way to ask is, does the customer want something before they get everything? And usually, if you talk through the risk involved in delaying, most customers would like to be able to start using pieces of what you're building before they get every single thing that they want. I think one of the things that does the most damage to software engineering projects is if we have the mentality that we're building it like a house to where it's actually done. Software usually, if software is doing something important, it probably is never done, right? Because there's always going to be ways to improve it, to make it do something as the business grows and develops. I guess maybe there's some things that aren't like that, maybe small libraries or utility programs. But for software that's running your business, unless your business is completely static, it's going to need to be changed. So the mentality of how do we get something that's usable that you get return on investment from earlier is very, very valuable. So another way to ask the question is, does the customer want the option to go live earlier? Or are they great with just saying, we're going to have one date when we could possibly go live, whatever that gets pushed out to is when it is? I think most customers are going to be happy with going with having the ability to go live sooner, even if they choose not to go live until later, because they want some more of those things that don't actually make the MVP cut. Okay, so especially when the customer is asked what hurts the most by way to solve a problem now. Yes, that's a very, very good point. So we're going to do a competitive quiz.